My name is Frank Kodak, and today, July 14th, 2013, I am pleased to have the opportunity to speak with a dear friend for more than 30 years, Richard J. Dick Spinelli, Executive Vice President of William S. Hine & Company. Dick and I are sitting in the Hine Suite at the Sheraton Hotel in Seattle, Washington, the site of the 2013 annual meeting of the American Association of Law Libraries. Dick, given our long friendship, it is a particular pleasure for me to speak with you as part of the Oral History of Law Librarianship project. That is doubly true because of the critical role you have played in the creation of this oral history project, especially its distribution as a component of Spinelli's Law Library reference shelf on Hine Online. So thank you very much.
You're welcome. I'm very, very pleased to be here and to be part of this oral history project.
Very good. So let's begin by learning a little bit about you personally. Can you tell us a bit about your early life, where you were raised, your family, what your childhood was like?
I was born and raised in northern New Jersey. I am a first-generation U.S. citizen. My mother was born in Italy. My father was born here in the United States a couple years after his family or his parents emigrated from Italy. I went to Catholic school as a youngster and then transferred into the public school system in Teaneck, New Jersey, along with my brother, who's a year older. And I have lived in Teaneck until I left, graduated from Teaneck High School and went to the College of William and Mary. I have married my high school sweetheart soon after I graduated from college and embarked on my career. My first marriage had two sons, Rich and Chris, who now live in Southern California and very successful in their own right. I remarried Marion McNulty, who at that time was the editor of the ALL newsletter. She had two daughters by her first marriage. This was a couple of years after my first wife had passed away, and she has two daughters. I have two stepdaughters, Rachel and Ann Renee, both successful in their own right. Rachel living in Chicago and Ann Renee living in Austin, Texas.
And today you spend a lot of time in the desert in Southern California.
Yes, I've semi-retired from the Hine Company about 3 years ago. Moved out to the desert of Southern California, where I now can pursue some of my other passions, one of which being golf, and also being able to watch more baseball games and things of that nature.
Very good. Well, that actually is a nice lead-in to question about your hobbies, passions, and pursuits outside the field of legal information, although I know most of the folks who know you in the profession would question whether you're ever outside the field of law librarianship, but I know in fact you are.
I am. As you know, I'm an avid sports fan, baseball being the sport of choice. And when I was being brought up in northern New Jersey, most of my friends are Yankee fans because the Yankees in the 40s and 50s were obviously a very, very successful baseball team. And I had one friend that had moved to Teaneck from Brooklyn, New York, and we became close buddies. And it was his influence that I early on became a Dodger fan. So I was on the outside, and to this day I remained a Dodger fan even when they broke my heart and left New York or Brooklyn and moved to Los Angeles. So that is, one of my passions is being just an avid baseball fan. And as you know, I mean, the baseball SIS and some of these other situations that we've been involved in has been just, it's right up my alley.
Well, it's been great being your friend for so long, and the fact that we're both avid Dodger fans makes it that much better. So very good.
We exchange our emails with one another.
Absolutely.
This situation with the Dodgers.
Now that we know something about your personal life, can you tell us about your educational and professional training, and perhaps your early career aspirations?
I was after I graduated from high school, I went to William and Mary in Williamsburg, Virginia, where I was a political science government major. It was more of a liberal arts background because everything I was reading to that point pointed to if I wanted to get out into the corporate world, the liberal arts background was one of the better avenues to follow, and that's what I did. I always had this dream or this goal that I would work for some large corporation in some capacity, possibly in sales, but initially in a management program where I would just then continue to advance through the ranks, so to speak. That career was put on hold, or that venture was put on hold because while I was at William & Mary, I was an ROTC cadet, which then after graduating obligated me to 2 years of serving at this point in the U.S. Army, which I did following my college graduation.
I have to ask, how did someone from Teaneck, New Jersey end up down in Virginia at William and Mary?
I guess it was two things. Number one, I thought I'd stay in New Jersey. That was my, at Rutgers University, it was the state school in New Jersey. And that was probably my plan, and I did get accepted. My brother, who was a year older, was a student at William and Mary. And William and Mary turned out to be a much, much smaller institution, even though it's a state of Virginia institution. It was a much, much smaller institution, and I thought I would thrive more in that environment. And obviously the programs that they offered were somewhat attuned to be looking for a strong liberal arts education.
Okay, so you returned from the service. How and when did you become involved in legal publishing?
When I was at William & Mary for one of the years, I was out of college for a year and going to night school in Teaneck, New Jersey at Fairleigh Dickinson University. And because my brother and I were both in college at the same time, we each had obviously to help pay for our education. I needed a job while I was out of college, and unfortunately, since I was only going to be out of William & Mary for about 9 months, it was very, very difficult to get any position. At one point, I think it was probably September of the year I was out of school, I went to the unemployment agency in Hackensack, New Jersey, and there was a posting that the Fred B. Rothman Company had a job opening for a shipping clerk. And I took the posting and I called and I got an appointment, and I went to the Rothman Company and met Fred Rothman at the time. And he hired me with the idea that he would only hire me if I promised to go back to school 9 months hence, which I did. And at that time, it was 1962, I was hired for $48 a week to be a shipping clerk, sweep the floors, and do some other gopher things in the organization. But that was my first exposure to the law library profession. Very
good. So you've mentioned Fred B. Rothman. I wonder if he or others served as a mentor or provided guidance that was important to you in your career.
I think before Fred, I had two other real mentors. One, when I was in the Army, I was in the Quartermaster Corps, and I just assumed that being in the Quartermaster Corps, I would sit in some office, sign papers related to supply, and that would be it. And when I finished my basic training, which was part infantry and part in the Quartermaster School, I was assigned as a company commander to a transportation unit in New York, and that was somewhat of a shock because I knew nothing about military discipline, I knew nothing about leading a company or anything of that nature. It's fortunate that when I did assume that position, I really came in as the executive director, the second in command. The company commander was still there, and he had another about 45 days before he was released from the service, so I had sort of an on-the-job training with him for about 45 days. During my military service, my first mentor was probably my first sergeant. This was an individual who had spent at that point about 28 years in the service. I think he enlisted after World War II, but did serve in the Korean War, was on MacArthur's staff. And the first sergeant in any company is really the between the company commander and the enlisted men. He was an enlisted man, so he had to obviously represent their interests, but at the same time, he had to be my mouthpiece to a certain extent to the enlisted personnel in the company. And I learned how he really handled that position of almost walking a tightrope, where he had to, see both sides of the story, or both sides of an issue, and had to represent both sides because that was his role. And he was somebody who, as I said, he retired when I was still company commander, but he was probably my first mentor. After I left the military, I embarked on my, started to send resumes to large corporations. I was then, as I said earlier, looking to get into the corporate environment and move up. And I did get hired by Johnson & Johnson, the baby products and pharmaceutical company in New Jersey, as at that time a management trainee. And there were four of us, four supervisory level people. And when we were hired, we were told that we would be training to be managers and moving up in their corporate ladder, but we would be working shift work for 18 to 36 months. In my case, I was in the sales and distribution center, which was a very, very large warehouse where the manufactured product, Micron, baby shampoo, baby powder, would come into the warehouse, it would be stored, and then eventually shipped to other distribution points or directly to retailers. And my first manager there was a gentleman, a Rutgers University graduate, played minor league baseball in the Cincinnati Reds organization, never made it to the major leagues, but he was an individual that I envied how he handled himself. He obviously was he was my boss and the boss of three other individuals similar to me. He also, like we did, had worked with the unionized people. In the ship sales and distribution area, we supervised anywhere from 12 to 30 unionized people, workers in a warehouse operation. And also how he handled himself when the Johnson & Johnson executives would come by our facility to meet with other people, how he handled those. So his demeanor, the way he just conducted himself, regardless of the environment he was in or the people he was with, set another standard for me in terms of being a mentor. After I had been at Johnson & Johnson for about 12 months, I did get a promotion, so I felt that I was on my way. And 3 months after that, about 3 months after that, Fred Rothman called me, and he said that they had a new position that they had at the Rothman Company, and was I interested? I said, Fred, I just had been promoted a couple months before. I thought I was, on a nice career path, and I said I appreciated it. I just turned it down. And a couple months after Fred called me, I then got transferred to another department within sales and distribution. It was the shipping area, and it just exposed me to more things that were happening on this career path that I was trying to follow. Then about 4 months after that, my former manager was now down in one of the manufacturing plants, the baby products lines, and they were having some union issues with people on the production lines. And I had a fairly good relationship with the union members, so he came to the sales and distribution center and asked if I could be transferred to the manufacturing plant. I had another colleague who went that route, and in effect the doors to sales and distribution in the downtown sort of closed behind him. So I didn't know if I wanted to go that route, and I then called Fred Rothman and I said, do you have that position that you offered me a few months ago? And of course he didn't, but they created another position for me. So I left Johnson & Johnson and in 1968 went to work for the Rothman Company.
Very good. That's a fascinating story. So you began at Fred B. Rothman Company in South Hackensack, New Jersey, April 1968 as an order processor. You remained there even after they moved to Colorado until 1993. Tell us a little bit about those 25 years, including your responsibilities and experiences, and perhaps something about the people with whom you worked.
Well, at that time, there were when I was with the Rothman Company on that part-time basis back when I was in college, I think there were 7 employees. When I returned in 1968, I think it was probably about a dozen employees. Fred Rothman, of course, being the president. Paul Rothman had joined the organization about a year before I came on board. And Gene Wapisky, the former Hofstra law librarian, also had joined the Rothman Company in their periodicals department. And he was there as well as mostly other clerical people. When I was hired, my position as an order processor was really in the green slip service area. The green slips had started as a bibliographic service on an experimental basis in January of 1968. And there were 30 institutions or 30 libraries that were provided with this service on an experimental trial basis, no charge, to evaluate it. And my first AAL meeting was in Philadelphia in July of 1968. And that was the first time that the Rothman Company invited the green slip subscribers to a session to critique this bibliographic service and to ask, what changes would they like to see, what were the negatives and positives about the service that was really designed by law librarians through Fred Rothman as an acquisition service.
So I wonder, some people who may watch this interview may have no idea what green slips, why are they called that, what are they, what is he talking about?
Back in 1968, this is before electronic ordering and creation of orders, the Rothman Company developed this green slip service where they actually printed on 3x5 slips of paper new publications in law and related fields. It was an announcement service. And anything that was printed on a green colored slip meant that publication, if a library wished to order it, was available for the Rothman Company as a book dealer. If it was printed on a white slip of paper, saying 3x5 slip, it would be a new publication, but it was a publication that Rothman could not handle because the book was either not sold through the trade or it was a no discount item that Rothman didn't want to handle. But it was basically an announcement service of new materials in law and related fields that in that first 6 months was distributed daily to these 30 libraries who were receiving the information on an experimental basis. At that first session in Philadelphia in 1968, one of the changes that was made was that the green slips, instead of being a daily service, would be a weekly service. When it was a daily service, Fred Rothman would receive all the brochures that librarians would receive in the morning. He'd go into his office, he'd do some selection, he'd pass those selections on to a clerical individual who would check to see if those books had, any of those books had already been listed in the service. If they weren't, they typed up a form that was by noon sent over to a printer. Printer came back at 3 o'clock with sheets of paper. They were cut up into 3x5 slips, just sorted and then mailed on a daily basis to these 30 libraries.
So Fred was doing the initial selection.
Right. The idea was librarians kept getting all of this information over their desks daily. Was there any way that the system could be devised that they wouldn't have to look at this information? Fred, being a former law librarian from New York University, they felt, and his contemporaries, Francis Farmer, Balfour Lavian, a number of librarians in that era, Morris Cohen, thought that if somebody could pre-select for them and then just in effect send them information of the materials that he thought would be of interest to them. And it was aimed at the larger libraries, even though eventually there were small libraries that were subscribers. For the Yales and Harvards, you wanted to have a very broad scope, and that was what Fred did. He would select the material, was checked, and then sent out to these 30 schools. The other thing that was decided, or the decision that was made at that first session, was that now, instead of being free, it would be a subscription service. My recollection, it may have been around $150 or $200 the first year, and they would receive these notifications on a weekly basis.
But well worth that really relatively small price to have someone be doing that.
And then my responsibilities really initially was the service had started, again, it was on a free basis, but was to oversee the orders as they were placed with the Rothman Company, to order the material, the books from the various publishers. The books would come in, responsibility is to put them in inventory, and then eventually ship the books out, or process them for shipping when orders would come in from libraries. And that was my order processing exposure there. I also then oversaw the clerical people who did the actual physical orders to the publishers, and then the invoicing to the customers as all part of that green slip service.
Now eventually when you were at Rothman, you moved from that area of the company into more active sales work, visiting libraries and such. Can you reflect a little bit about that?
After about 2 years, I was moved from the green slip area to the Rothman Publications area, which was more the journals that they had the inventory, the secondhand inventory, the journals that they had reprint rights to, the books they were publishing, and also the books they were reprinting. That little by little gave me more and more exposure to their publications, which eventually would serve when I did go out and try to sell that material. For the first, probably 10 years that I was at the Rothman Company, 8 years, the traveling I did was either to AALL, the AALS annual meeting, and maybe 1 or 2 chapter meetings, and then a sporadic visit. It wasn't until shortly before we moved to Colorado that I started assuming more of the outside responsibilities. And once we did move to Colorado in 1978, Fred Rothman was still active in the organization, but he was backing off. Paul Rothman was taking a much more active role in the day-to-day operation of the organization and assuming a lot of the responsibilities that his father had. And then I then began assuming more of the outside sales work in the mid to late 70s, and then doing the library visits.
Very good. Well, we'll come back to your outside work in a moment, but let's try to catch up with how your career progressed. So in 1993, you did leave Rothman and you joined William S. Heinemann Company, which really was a rival legal publisher, and with whom you continue to be associated to this day, 20 years later. What was that move like for you? And I need to ask, there's some story going on around about your moving office experience initially when you arrived at Heinemann.
First, the transition was in some ways difficult because now I was thought to be going with the enemy, or at least we were rivals. While Bill and I always had a good relationship, we really were competitors.
You're talking about Bill Hine Jr.?
Yes, Bill Hine Jr. We really were competitors over the years, but we always had a very civil relationship. I think it has to be remembered that the generation before me, Fred Rothman, Bill Hine Sr., they were very competitive, as well as with the Dennis Company in Oceana. rivalry and competitive could continue with the next generation with Paul Rothman and Bill Hine Jr. But I was kind of on the outside. I was on the perimeter of that fray, so to speak. And it was interesting because I was not a family member, but obviously my loyalties were with the Rothman Company. When by mutual agreement I left the Rothman Company and eventually went to the Hine Company, I was really welcomed with open arms. I think the key to my move was Bill had been doing most of the traveling, and he really wanted to come back off the road. And while I traveled extensively for the Rothman Company, not to the extent that I would eventually do for the Hine Company, but I really, when I did join the Hine Company, it was an easier transition. I knew the marketplace. I knew the librarians. I knew most of the people that both were dealing with. I had, of course, adjusted the Hine philosophy and how they conducted their business. I had to learn the Hine products while I was somewhat familiar with them. I wasn't as familiar as if I had already been part of that organization. So that was part of the adjustment. This little story that you were referring to, my first visit to the Hine Company after I'd been hired, is I went up there and they didn't really have an office for me.
In Buffalo?
In Buffalo. I went to Buffalo. They didn't have an office for me. And the plan was I would come up probably 4 or 5 times a year during this early part of my career with them. And so the first time I visited with them, I had no office, and what they did, Dan Rosati, the staff, went to, in effect, almost like a chalkboard, and he looked at that board to see who was either called in sick that day or was on vacation, and I was then given that individual's office. And it was fine because I had very little, I had no papers, no files or anything like that. I was more spending as much time with Bill Hine and Kevin Marmy and some of the other staff members there learning about the Hine business as I was in any other situation. But I returned then, I think about 3 months later, and I was in the same situation. I looked at who was not there. They put me in an office. And then it was getting a little uncomfortable because I was starting to accumulate notes. I was starting to obviously visit libraries, and I had to spread out some things. I needed some privacy to make phone calls. So eventually, I think not on that visit, another visit, I was given an office saying, okay, here's your office, and great. And I had an office, I was able to leave papers there in a desk, and a few months later when I came back, I learned that my papers were not in that desk anymore. They had been moved to another office. This other office, they said, this is your office, and I was able to even hang pictures in that office that were in my office in the Rothman facility, and I felt more comfortable. I think I felt I had arrived. 3 months later, I came back, and the pictures were down. Somebody else was in that office, and Dan Rosati had a great idea. He said, whatever office we put you in, he hung my pictures on one of these rolling dividers, and they would roll the pictures into my office so that I at least feel comfortable. Eventually, I did get my own office there, even though you could understand it was a situation where I was only there 3 or 4 times a year, and because of staffing changes and consolidations and things, my office was kind of like a moving target.
Well, I know they weren't trying to send you any negative messages. I know that for sure. So let's kind of compare a little bit your responsibilities with Rothman and then with Hine. You've already briefly noted that when you came to Hine, ultimately you began to be on the road even more than you have been with Rothman. Tell us a little bit about that and just comparing Hine with Rothman.
I think I was fortunate that when I started with the Rothman Company, Fred Rothman took me under his wing, and he was what we alluded earlier to as a mentor. Paul Rothman is an extension of Fred. So I was very, very fortunate to have that. When I moved to the Hine Company, it was a very similar thing. Bill was very, very nurturing and very, very supportive of what we thought my role would be. And to even a larger extent, Kevin Marmy and other people, Dan Rosati, they were the ones who, really, really helped me along to make that adjustment, make the change, and then encouraged me when I go out. And I think that we had a mutual respect. Kevin and I go back years we were again on the outside of the two families, and we had a great relationship from early on in my career with Rothman and Kevin's career.
Kevin is the president.
Kevin is the current president of the Hine Company, has been president now for probably almost between 15 and 20 years. But we've always had a great relationship. And again, if it weren't for Bill Hines Jr. and Kevin, when I joined the company, of supporting me and encouraging me, because I never thought of myself as a salesperson. Even when I was with the Rothman Company, I looked more at, I had other designs, or at least other things that I thought I accomplished in the role that I played. But they encouraged me, And with that support and that, nurturing, I think that it helped me prosper as I did the more and more it became the visible outside person. And it got to the point where I probably was traveling 40, 45 weeks a year for the Hine company when I was doing all the visits and at that point.
So let's talk a little bit about that. Anyone who knows you knows that the first time they see you in a while, basically you're going to get the itinerary for the last several months, or at least that's the way it used to be. Maybe not so much anymore, that you're playing more golf than traveling, but nothing wrong with that. But visiting libraries and librarians in all parts of the country, that's really a hallmark of your much of your career. From all appearances, you have not just survived, but you've actually thrived in what to most would be a very challenging environment. I wonder if you can tell us a little bit about your secret to success.
I think it really is based upon I look forward to visiting librarians. I really, really enjoyed the relationships that I was able to cultivate over the years, learning about librarians in general, specifically the individuals, what made them tick. I tried to become as much a personal friend to each of these customers or clients as I was a professional friend. I think one thing that has to be looked at is I'm not a librarian by training, I'm not a lawyer. And over the years, early in my development, I had to get to a point where librarians would, number one, accept me as part of their profession, and number two, respect me. And part of that was I never went to any library that I visited with initially saying I needed an order before I left that library. I tried to establish a personal relationship with the librarian, and really I did that first by, and I even preach to the younger generation in the Hine Company now, is I tried to sell myself. I wanted the librarian to accept me for what I was, and if I felt that they accepted me for the person I was and respected me, they would then, they would listen to me at least. Then my next goal was to sell the organization I represented, whether it was the Rothman Company or the Hine Company. If they had confidence in me and they were willing to deal with the organization I represented, that was two things. Then I might try to sell them a product. But I think I've always remained enthusiastic, and so I look forward to the visits. Going on the road, yes, it wasn't easy, but it became so much part of my lifestyle that I just enjoyed visiting with librarians. I enjoyed what they represented. I enjoyed their philosophy, and generally always look forward to visiting them.
Very good. I wonder, you mentioned that you've tried to talk to people in the Hine Company about that philosophy, and it seems to me that having interacted with sales representatives for many publishing companies, you were pretty unique in that approach and that philosophy, and I feel like that the Hine Company has adopted that approach, and it's become really in here today, 2013, a company that has a very good profile among law librarians, and I suspect that a lot of it has to do with your approach.
Well, I think I often reflect back. The first time I did a sales visit for the Rothman Company, I came to California. And I visited two librarians who were more attached to Bill Hine Sr. and went to visit them to see why they weren't dealing with the Rothman Company in any fashion. And when I returned, I was just trying to establish a relationship. And when I returned to, at that time, New Jersey, Fred Rothman, the first question, what orders did you get? And I said, I didn't get any orders. That wasn't my goal when I went out. And I think that was the philosophy. And I think over a period of time, that probably changed in the organization, each organization, because I was really telling the people that the key to it is, if you have an appointment with an individual and you follow part of this approach, I mean, you have to use your own personality as part of your own approach, but you want to be able to call that person in 6 months and have that person say, yes, they'd like to see you again. And that was always the sort of the basis of how I looked at how I presented myself. And I think it has. I think I have hopefully left some legacy of that part of that philosophy. Although I tell the younger generation in the Hine Company, it's your, you have to take what I may be telling you, what Bill Hine may be telling you, or the Kevin Marmion, and adapt it to your own personality and how you would approach it. But really, I said, you've got to have instill a sense of confidence that your clients have with you.
Very good. So you've been, by my count, hopefully my math is correct, you've spent 45 years in the legal publishing industry. most of it in very close and constant contact with law librarians. And so as such, I think you're uniquely qualified to reflect on changes in both publishing and librarianship. I wonder if you can share some of what you've seen over those years, perhaps what is different and what, if anything, is the same.
I think one of the sameness is a vendor's approach to your marketplace. You've got to be versed in what you're doing. You've got to have a relationship, regardless of what you're maybe selling them or what information you're passing on. I think another thing that never changes is communications. One of the things I've always emphasized is communications between you, the vendor, and the librarian or the library staff. One of the things I've always told librarians is we think everything is fine from our viewpoint unless you tell us it isn't. And unless you tell us it isn't, whatever issues you may have will continue to be issues. So I've always emphasized the communication, and that doesn't change or has not changed. I think that things have changed. When I joined the profession, people were building libraries and library collections, an extension of that, preserving all the material. They didn't throw anything out. And back in the 60s and 70s, acquisitions budgets were quite, there was a lot of money available. Capital funds were available. If people ran into space, they built an addition or a new building, and that was very, very prevalent. Now what's changed, obviously budgets have changed, the formats have changed, so some of the philosophy how collections are done now, I don't think preservation is as important. I mean, the librarians still want to preserve materials, but it's more they don't have to do it individually themselves, whether it's in another medium or there's one library that's preserving certain materials. I think more it's instead of as much collection development today, it's collection management. What do we do with what we've got? What do we keep? What can we dispose of because it's now available in a format such as an electronic format where we no longer have to keep it. So I think the relationships stay the same. I still think if you're trying to sell something, you've got to follow sort of the premise that I say, sell yourself first. And I think also the communications. When I reflect back on looking at some of the things we've done, I think I've been given some credit for at least always being the middle person between the librarian and the organization, and at least representing their interests. And it's not that I'm not necessarily on the librarian side or on the company side, but I think if somebody is a conduit for that, any issues that may exist, you can solve problems easier. And I think it's important for a librarian to have a name and a face that they think they can go to, regardless of the situation, whether it's 20 or 30 years ago or today, that they can go to with confidence if there is an issue or a problem.
That's interesting, and I can't help but reflect that what you've just mentioned about being sort of the middleman goes all the way back to that early mentor who was kind of in that position as well.
So, exactly.
So that.
And another thing I think that, as an aside to that, is, not only communication, I think another approach that I had was when I would visit a library, you sit with the director, sometimes the associate director of collection development. I always made a point of asking the librarian, could I speak to some of the staff, whether it's a serious librarian, acquisitions librarian, and go meet with them just to see, not to meet them, but also to say, are there any issues? Do you have any problems, whether it has to do with billing, with claims, whatever it was. And there were a number of librarians over the years who would, when I was visiting, would gather their whole staff together, a majority of staff together, and we meet in the conference room. We talk back and forth, and I think the value of that for me was that these people, I might not always remember them a year from now, but they hopefully remembered me. And selfishly, if they advanced through the profession and they then were in a say, a decision-making position, they would remember me and come to me for what their needs are. So I always enjoy doing that. But again, it's being that conduit between the librarian and the vendor, and always making sure that I would meet with other members of the staff to see if they had any issues, or if even compliments, if they want me to bring their regards back to individuals in the organization, which I always did. And I think helped me get a further foothold into the profession and into library staffs.
Well, I'm glad you mentioned that, as someone who has stood next to you at the Heim booth in the ALL exhibit hall and seen just the multitudes of people who come up and speak with you, and certainly some of them are directors, but many of them are not. And so I think that really speaks to this point about not just limiting yourself to a relationship with an existing director. You touched on this the change in the approach of libraries today and into managing the collection more than just preserving it. And kind of tied into that, you were instrumental in the creation and development of one of the, what I would have to say, the great legal publishing success stories of recent years, Hein Online, which received AALL's Best New Product Award in 2001. And now that product has been enhanced by the addition of Spinelli's Law Library Reference Shelf, a tribute right there. So tell us a little bit about your work with Hein Online and what it's like to have an online library with your own name on it.
Well, the early development of Hein Online, before it was even Hein Online, I give Kevin Marmion most of the credit. He is the idea person behind it. And while there are some different ways that we thought we would develop it, all of us were involved in one way or another, but Kevin was really the person, obviously with Bill Hines' support and his input, that got the product going. And when it first started, the idea was that we put journals up. Initially they were released, I think there were 24 titles, about 250,000 pages or images that came out in 2000. And the journals were from inception of volume 1 up to the copyright point, with the ultimate goal to bring those journals up to the mid-80s. Our original plan was not to overlap with the Lexis Westlaw coverage. We would just go up to that point. That changed rather quickly as we both went out to get licensing agreements with the various journals. Many of the license agreements that Hein had and that he also absorbed when the Hein company bought the Rothman company in 1998 had exclusive reprint and microform rights, and in cases electronic rights, but in many cases it didn't address the electronic issue. So we went back and to get non-exclusive electronic rights to a lot of those journals. As we were doing that, the idea said, why do we want to stop with, in the mid-80s? And a number of librarians said, Blair Kaufman's mother said, you know, do everything in the indexes and bring it as close to date as in effect our agreements would permit us. Initially, there were some of the large journals like Harvard and Columbia and Yale allowed us to scan their material, but we had to have a moving wall or an embargo. They were concerned about us competing with their print subscription price, income, and things of that nature. But the original idea of going only to the mid-80s soon evolved into going as close to date. As that developed, as we were designing it, three of us, for the most part, Kevin Marmion, Dan Rosati, and I, went out on the road to bring this idea to the librarians. Kevin and I went to Chicago, and you may have even been in that meeting at John Marshall. Meeting. And it was the Chicago area librarians, a couple from Indiana and a couple from, and I think Wisconsin were there. And Kevin and I made a presentation of what this idea was. And it was interesting to listen, and you may have to correct me, but there were 3 or 4 individuals, and you were one of them that made remarks. I know Judith Wright was very in favor of an electronic resource where these journals would be made available in a PDF form. Judith was an individual who, at the University of Chicago, had a large print collection, but she skipped over the microform generation. She never adopted to microform as a preservation or as a duplicate or backup copy. You were somebody, I think, was more traditional too.
I was traditional.
You said that print was the way to go, and I think your comments were echoed by Roger Jacobs too. The comment that we laughed at the most, both not laughed at there, but after, Bob Doyle, who was at Loyola Chicago, made a remark that in the 1970s, we were selling the print journal. At that time was the height of the reprinting of out-of-print issues and volumes so we could complete the print holdings of these libraries, and we were selling them the print. And then in the 1980s, microforms sort of came into the picture, and that medium, and we started then selling him the same information on a microform to say this should be your backup copy, you can reduce the space of your committee. And now 20 years later, or 15 years later, we're now coming out with an electronic product, and we want to collect money from a library for the same content that they've already paid for twice. So these are some of the remarks, but we made a presentation to the Chicago area librarians. Dan and I made a presentation to a New England group. Dan and I went to NYU and made a presentation of their whole staff, and NYU probably was one of the first libraries that subscribed to Hein Online. And even at that point, when we now are bringing it out, Jim Heller called me one day and said his dean, Dean Reveley, was
Jim Heller, William and Mary.
Jim Heller at William and Mary called me, and the dean of the law school there had brought an idea to him of that JSTOR, wanted to put legal periodicals in their database. At that point, it was mostly social science journals, journals in that area, political science, social science. And Jim had said that the Hine Company was designing this, or was coming out with this online product of journals. Jim, when he called me, then I flew down to Williamsburg and met with Dean Revely and Jim, and we talked about this. And that led to a meeting with the Association of American Law Schools. They were about to endorse the JSTOR concept of bringing legal journals to entities that did not have access to this information. We really wanted AALS to endorse our, concept also, and they wouldn't. So Dan, Kevin, and I flew to Washington, D.C. and made a presentation to a group at AALS, there were a couple of deans, Dick Danner, I think Joan Hallen, so a couple of law school deans, as I said, and the AALS staff. Dean Revely from William & Mary is one of them. And while it was kind of a lukewarm reception, they felt that the Hine Company wouldn't have the international impact in the profession to get this information to those who didn't have access, that we would really be, as Bob Doyle said, reselling it to those we already had established as our market. It took a few months of some persuasion, and we finally they did endorse JSTOR, and they finally sent a letter out to their members with an endorsement of Hine Online. So that made us feel good, but that was some of the early things, the early rumblings. My collection, that's a different story. When that was presented to me, we always wanted to develop something and have me instrumental in developing a collection that would be aimed at law librarians. And I thought I had a weighted vote, but I didn't. They wanted to put my name on it, and I didn't want my name on it because, while it was a great legacy, I just felt that I've always been an individual that had these relationships. I was under the radar and just didn't think it was necessary to put my name on it. But Kevin Marmon and the others at the staff persuaded me, and we then named it after me. And I'm very proud of it. I'm delighted to be involved in the development of it and the additions.
Well, as well you should be. I will just say, as someone who's done a fair amount of research and writing about law librarians and AALL and the like, it's a great resource, and I love having things at my fingertips. So it's fabulous, and it continues to develop. And of course, we're very pleased that this oral history of law librarianship is a part of that.
That's really added to the excitement. I was telling Pat not too long ago, and each of you, that once we started releasing these videos, well, number one, just the idea of doing them and trying to capture these snapshots of individuals, and it really started as an idea that Pat monitors the AAL retired list.
Pat Kehoe.
Mm-hmm. And we were really losing some of these individuals within the profession that we would never be able to tap their knowledge and their experiences. And it started as looking at those, and then it obviously grew from there. And the response to this point of the videos that have been released has been very, very good, very, very gratifying. So it's nice to be part of it. It's nice to be, have your name on something like that. But more importantly, it's nice just to be part of something that has gotten some acceptance in the profession.
Well, great. Dick, let's switch gears just a little bit. You've talked about your philosophy in working with law librarians during your visits. You talked about the relationships that became both professional and personal friendships, and I certainly would count myself in that group. So I wonder if there are any librarians that you might want to reflect on, people that you've worked with or developed particularly close friendships with. Or obviously Roy Mirsky comes to mind. Julius Mark might be another one. Anything you'd like to share with us?
Again, going back to when I first started in the profession, Fred Rothman introduced me to a number of these individuals early on. One of the earliest exposures I had was, 1969 was the meeting in Houston. Around 1969, when the meeting was in Houston, Texas, at that time AALL was still conducting its pre-convention institutes. The one that was being held, it was actually in Austin, Texas. And I think it was at a motel that we're now, the LBJ Library now sits, or right in that neighborhood where it was. But anyway, Marion Bonner and Roy Mirsky were the hosts of that institute. It was an acquisitions institute. Fred Rothman was invited to be on the panel, and he agreed to be on it and pay his own expenses if he could bring me along, because I obviously was very new in the profession. I was still an order processor, but I knew names, I knew faces, I knew some procedures. And so I did go. I went to the basic class, and on that, in that group on the faculty, so to speak, Fred Rothman, Mira Pimsler, I think Morris Cohen, Balfour Halevi, Roy Mirsky. There were a number of people that were at that time, some younger in the profession, but all who became heavyweights in the profession if they weren't already. And I went to the institute courses and obviously learned a lot. I probably learned more each. I think there were 2 evenings that we were together around the swimming pool and listening to not only the people that were on the panel, but the librarians. There were probably 60 or 70 librarians at least that were part of this Acquisitions Institute, and just listening to them exchange stories. So that was my first exposure to some of the people like the Roy Mirskys and the Morris Cohens and people of that nature. Like probably most other people in the profession, I think the closest way I can describe my relationship with Roy Mirsky was, I've never been physically on a roller coaster, but my relationship with Roy Mirsky was one of being on a roller coaster. There are some very, very great highs, there are some very, very bad lows, and we had, we went toe to toe on a number of issues. There are stories I could relate about Roy. I visited him one time. I was still with the Rothman Company, and Paul Rothman had decided to print the U.S. Report's official edition. It was public domain material. Bill Hine was already doing it, but Rothman decided they were going to join the fray and start doing it. And I was, at that time when I was traveling, I would bring to the attention of the librarians, and we had a sliding scale. If you purchased 1 copy, it may have been at the list price. 2 copies, there was a discount. And at that time, my recollection is Roy was getting, had 7 copies, 1 on depository and 6 he was getting from Bill Hine. And I said to Roy, I said, with getting 6 copies from us, it's going to entitle you, I think it was to a 20% discount. Roy jumped right at that. And so I went back with the order, and about 4 days after I was there, Roy calls me, and he said, I canceled my order with Hine, and I ended my order with you, but Bill Hine called me. He said he wanted to know why I canceled my order. And Roy said, I told him that Rothman was now offering me a 20% discount. Roy came back to me on that phone conversation and said, Bill Hine is now offering me a 25% discount. Will you exceed that? And I said, Roy, and I always consider myself quite ethical. I said, I gave you the scale of what our discount schedule was. For the number of copies you have, it's the discount I offered you. If Bill wants to offer you a 25% discount, go for it. So I canceled his order. And then I had a smile because now Bill had to give him 25% where he was giving him no discount up to that point. There are other things. I think one of the treasures I had about Roy later in both of our careers, or in his career, when Arlene, my first wife, was ill, there was a side of Roy that probably many people didn't see. He was a very, very warm and caring individual when he got to know you. And he was very, very supportive of me when my wife was going through her illness, and very supportive of me after she passed away. And then even 10 years later, when I was diagnosed with cancer, Roy was on the phone with me on a very, very regular basis, always concerned about me, then emailing me and things of that nature. So I was, I did see it the other side, but admittedly, it was a roller coaster ride through most of my dealings with Roy.
Well, I saw a glimpse of that in his interaction and caring for Don Dunn, of course, is another.
That was another individual. Yeah. He was very, very close to. In fact, when Don was gravely ill and passed away, Roy was in Australia. And he called me from Australia and said that I had been in touch with Don over the period of the 1-year illness that he had. And Roy had called me from Australia and said that he's trying to change his flight back. I think Don had just passed away. I spoke to Don a couple of days before he passed away when he was released from the hospital. And he was at home and told that he just had a matter of days to live. And I called, wanted to speak to his son, and I did speak to his son, but his son put Don on the phone. Don and I had a short conversation. It was just days before he passed away. And when this news got to Roy, Roy had called me, said impossible for him to get back from Australia. Would I be able to represent him as well as myself at the memorial service they had for Don, which I did. Another individual who I look back fondly was Julius Mark. Again, I had met Julius early in my career, and Julius was as New Yorker as any New Yorker could be. And the Rothman Company was located in South Hackensack, New Jersey. It was a stone's throw from New York. It was probably 7 miles across the George Washington Bridge.
And that time, Julius was at NYU.
He was a law librarian at NYU, and he would visit us from time to time. And you always got the impression when he visited, when he crossed the George Washington Bridge He thought he was going into an uncivilized area, that he didn't know what he would find there, and it was always, he could not wait to get back in the car, to get back into New York City, which he thought was civilized. I had also visited Julius when he was, after he left NYU, he was the director of the law library at St. John's, and I went over to have lunch with him. And we talked in the library for a while, exchanged some stories. Then we said, okay, we're going to go to one of my favorite restaurants here. And it turned out to be an IHOP. And I think he may have gone there for breakfast from time to time, just loved the place. And here you thought I'll take Julius to lunch. And here I ended up at an IHOP restaurant to entertain him for his elaborate lunch.
Dick, you are known, respected, and I think it is fair to say loved by law librarians throughout the country. In 2010, AALL President Catherine Lemon formally recognized this by presenting you with a Presidential Certificate of Appreciation, quote, for his over 40 years of exemplary service to AALL and its chapters and his steadfast friendship to all law librarians. And this year, you will be inducted into the AALL Hall of Fame, joining one of your mentors, Fred Rothman. Can you describe your feelings about these honors and more generally your relationship with AALL and the law librarianship profession?
Well, first, obviously, I'm very honored. I joke about that if you live long enough, you probably outlive your enemies, and therefore, those people who might have voted against my selection are not around anymore. But I am really humbled by it. I've been attached to this profession for, as you mentioned earlier, 45 years. And I've really grown to love it and be supportive of it, not only the individuals, but the association in general. And my association with AALL started in the 1960s because the Rothman Company published the AALL publication series. So I've always had an affinity for the association and the people involved in the association, whether it was headquarters or the executive board, because of our relationship with the publication series. But I think, I think that being humble about it, I'm also very proud. I mean, it shows that maybe the philosophy I followed over the years of becoming friends with the individuals, I think providing a service to them has translated into the honor. And I sincerely appreciate it.
Dick, I don't think you ever had any enemies, so that's not an issue. So we're nearing the end of our conversation. I want to make sure you have the opportunity to touch on any topics that are important to you, but that we might not have brought up yet. Is there anything you'd like to add?
Well, just in closing, when we talk about these honors, when I was notified of the Hall of Fame selection, I spoke to Kevin Marmion at length about it, and I really said, and I meant this, and I truly do mean it. We talked about some of the mentors I've had, and if I didn't have those people behind me over the years, if I didn't have them supporting me, whether it was Fred Rothman or Paul Rothman or Bill Hine or Kevin Marmion, I don't think I would have achieved the success I would have. They gave me the support and the encouragement that I really needed, and they gave me the opportunity to go out and do these things. And so as much as, the award may be an individual award, I think it's as much a team award, that these are individuals that really were with me and by me, next to me, in front of me, behind me. And if it weren't for them, I don't think I would have achieved the success that I have to this point.
Well, that's very well put, and I'm sure that there is a lot of truth in that, but I think a lot of it has to do with you personally, so again, congratulations.
Thank you. And let me just add one thing. If it weren't for librarians such as you and all these other librarians, many of whom I've not mentioned, accepting me in the profession and, welcomed me, as well as then the encouragement and support of the Rothmans and the Hines and the Kevin Marmions, would be where I am today.
Okay. Dick Spinelli, on behalf of Pat Keogh and Michelle Wu, my colleagues with the Oral History of Law Librarianship Project, I want to thank you for taking time from your busy schedule to speak with us today about your experiences in the law library profession. Your remarks will be a valuable addition to the project and of interest to both current colleagues and those who will join the profession in the future. So thank you very much.
Thank you.